coexist. And then in 1085, Alfonso VI reconquers the city of Toledo, smack in the middle of the peninsula, under the banner of Christendom, and he immediately pacts with Jews and Muslims who had long inhabited the city, setting the stage for the continued coexistence of those three religions and their accompanying cultures in Toledo. So let's cut to medieval Toledo, and I'd like to focus on the first 3 points on this slide as examples of what the coexistence and collaboration of Muslims, Jews, and Christians brought to this city, a city unlike any other of its time. So to begin with, Toledo is at the cutting edge of science and philosophy. And this was due to the fact that Christian rulers inherited vast libraries that included important scientific and philosophical texts from the ancient world, as well as cutting-edge scientific discourse from the Islamic East. And of course, coming from the Islamic East, nearly all of this material was in classical Arabic. So, in the 12th century, this guy, Archbishop Raimundo of Toledo, initiates a school of translators in the city to translate some of the philosophical and religious works from classical Arabic to Latin. Jews, Christians, and Muslims worked together on this project. And eventually, the school would turn to mathematic and scientific texts as well, which led to some pretty important academic material for us here in the West. I'm going to play a very brief TED Talk to talk about one of these things.
I have the answer to a question that we've all asked. The question is, why is it that the letter X represents the unknown? Now, I know we learned that in math class, but now it's everywhere in the culture. The X Prize, the X Files, Project X, TEDx. Where'd that come from? About 6 years ago, I decided that I would learn Arabic, which turns out to be a supremely logical language. To write a word or a phrase or a sentence in Arabic is like crafting an equation because every part is extremely precise and carries a lot of information. That's one of the reasons so much of what we've come to think of as Western science and mathematics and engineering was really worked out in the first few centuries of the Common Era by the Persians and the Arabs and the Turks. This includes the little system in Arabic called algebra, and algebra roughly translates to the system for reconciling disparate parts. Algebra finally came into English as algebra, one example among many. The Arabic texts containing this mathematical wisdom finally made their way to Europe, which is to say Spain, in the 11th and 12th century. And when they arrived, there was tremendous interest in translating this wisdom into a European language. But there were problems. One problem is there are some sounds in Arabic that just don't make it through a European voice box without lots of practice. Trust me on that one. Also, those very sounds tend not to be represented by the characters that are available in European languages. Here's one of the culprits. This is the letter sheen, and it makes the sound we think of as sh. Sh. It's also the very first letter of the word shay'un, which means something, just like the English word something, some undefined, unknown thing. Now in Arabic, we can make this definite by adding the definite article al, so this is al-shay'un, the unknown thing. And this is a word that appears throughout early mathematics, such as this 10th century derivation of proofs. The problem for the medieval Spanish scholars who were tasked with translating this material is that the letter sheen and the word shay'un can't be rendered into Spanish because Spanish doesn't have that sh, that sh sound. So by convention, they created a rule in which they borrowed the ck sound, the k sound, from the classical Greek in the form of the letter chi. Later, when this material was translated into a common European language, which is to say Latin, they simply replaced the Greek chi with the Latin x. And once that happened, Once this material was in Latin, it formed the basis for mathematics textbooks for almost 600 years. But now we have the answer to our question. Why is it that X is the unknown? X is the unknown because you can't say sh in Spanish. And I thought that was worth sharing.
Okay, so there we have it. We can't say sh in Spanish. All right, in the 13th century, under King Alfonso X the Wise, the school expands its work, now translating its documents into a revised version of Castilian, which was the language that people actually spoke rather than Latin. Now, transcribing this vulgar Latin, the language of the people, was a revolutionary act, and it would go on to establish the foundations of what we all know as Spanish. In addition, of course, to introducing many important scientific and philosophical ideas to the West, such as algebra. And throughout this process, Toledo becomes known elsewhere in Europe as the place of the dark sciences, namely physics, chemistry, algebra, and astrology. And other European learning institutions ban these studies, calling them heretical. And so now I'd like to turn to the architectural beauty created through the interplay between religions, languages, and cultures in the city of Toledo. This is the most visible example of the coexistence of the three cultures in the city, and it's also what immediately spoke to me upon setting foot in the city. And oftentimes, it's even difficult to determine whether you're seeing a church, a mosque, or a synagogue, at least at first blush. So this beautiful sanctuary, for example, belongs to a synagogue that was later turned into a church. Now, given the obvious Islamic architectural styling, I would have assumed it was originally a mosque, but that's not the case. As it turns out, it was always a synagogue. At the time, most architects and construction workers were Muslim in Toledo, and we still use in Spanish the word albañil from the Arabic to describe construction workers. And perhaps unsurprisingly, having Islamic architects and construction workers led to Islamic architecture. And additionally, since both Islam and Judaism prohibit images of people or animals in their sanctuaries, the Islamic architectural style works perfectly for building synagogues as well. Now, of course, we also see religious sanctuaries of one tradition being converted into sanctuaries of the conquering religion. This 13th century church is one of 18 churches in the city that were once mosques. And we can see here the Moorish horseshoe-style arch on the door and the minaret, which in mosques is used for the call to prayer, here converted into a bell tower for the subsequent church. So in this 14th century synagogue, the most important example of Spanish Jewish architecture, we see elements of all three cultures. The Muslim architects who reportedly built this one were the same ones that built La Alhambra, which happens to be the most important example of Islamic architecture in Spain. So if you recall, I said that you can't represent humans or animals in images in mosques or in synagogues. But in this case, the guy who had the synagogue built for his family, Mr. Samuel Levy, actually included a line in the main wall of the synagogue in homage to Pedro I, the king who gave him permission to build the synagogue, and also to ignore the existing laws that said that synagogues had to be smaller and lower than churches and void of decoration. And we also see Arabic transcriptions in the floral patterns of the stucco of that main wall. And these transcriptions were just decorative in nature, and we can see that they coexist right alongside Hebrew. And so all three cultures are represented in the main wall of the most important synagogue in Spain. And lastly, we have an example of early recycling, which I really like. This is a 12th century church, which was first a Visigoth temple, and then became a 9th century mosque when the Muslim conquerors arrived. And all three of those iterations used 2nd century Roman elements that they found nearby. So we see, for example, the Visigoth column with the Roman capital, and then the faces are scratched out on the Visigoth column because, again, in the mosque you couldn't show human faces. And now on to an important question. Was Toledo really a model of peaceful coexistence of people of different religious backgrounds? And a concept that came up time and again in my reading was this idea of discriminatory tolerance, a tolerance for certain aspects of life, such as religious practices, but discrimination in others, such as rights and taxes. Scholars seem to agree that it's difficult to judge how tolerant a medieval society was using our present-day understanding of tolerance, since such a concept had no social or moral meaning in medieval times. So in reality, the coexistence in Toledo was not some sort of idyllic paradise, but rather was marked by discrimination against religious minorities, and ultimately practicality. So for example, the forming of pacts during territorial expansion in order to win the favor of local elites and to continue expanding territory. Both Muslims and Christians did this. And in terms of who did what in medieval Toledo, Muslims were architects and construction workers, agriculturalists, scientists, and physicians, while Jews were merchants, artisans, bankers, government officials, and advisors to the Christian king himself. Everyone had their role, and together they made their society unlike any other history had seen to that point. And I would argue that there's still a pragmatic argument for multiculturalism today. As immigrant and Muslim cancer researcher Dr. Azra Raza posits, we need, quote, the best minds and the most minds to fight cancer and solve other seminal issues of our times. She goes on to say, speaking of her own family, which came over from Pakistan, 7 siblings who work in design, medicine, architecture, quote, we are enriching, prolonging, and saving American lives. We are just some of the many immigrants from many lands, of many faiths, who are and have always been an essential part of America's strength. We are hard workers, people with big ideas and big dreams, believers in this great country and our shared responsibility to make it even better for all of us. So we're no longer living in medieval times. America, Baltimore, and Gilman should reach higher. The coexistence of the 3 cultures in Toledo and other areas of the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages produced remarkable works of architectural beauty and produced or salvaged vast amounts of philosophical and scientific knowledge that may have been lost otherwise, including algebra, a system of reconciling disparate parts, which if you think about it, is what medieval Toledo did with people of disparate faiths. Think of the great works of beauty and bodies of knowledge that continue to be produced through multicultural collaboration. Today, the best and most current scientific research is carried out by multicultural, multilingual teams from all over the globe, which to me is a clear inheritance from the School of Translators of Toledo. And I'll leave you with a recent sign of optimism for religious tolerance in our own era, a gesture from Muslim groups in Pittsburgh who have donated money to the synagogue that suffered the recent tragedy. Thank you.
Seniors, remember, we're staying here. Seniors.